Hey, WCA, Mike Amori. I hope you enjoyed the class. Welcome back. Hope you had a good break. Those of you in the schools down here that were off this week, we were closed mainly because of President's Day weekend. A lot of chess players go down to Jersey to play in the amateur team. Okay, I'm not going to discuss the history between Nigel Short playing white and Timman with black. We did that in class. And let's get right into the game, and you can see the outcome and learn a lot. I mean, there were so many great ideas from this game, which starts as a win-hour French. And as we discussed in class, this is one of the coolest imbalances in all of chess, where in this position, black, as a French player, is willing to give away their dark squared bishop. And as we spoke about, it's hard to do that in the French. You know, if you look at move 1 for black, you're clearly shielding yourself for some of those early attacks in like the Scotch Gambit and some of the open games if you play e4, e5. So when you play e6, you get a totally different flavor of a game, right? But you do immediately lock in this bishop here on c8. So as a French player who's desperately always trying to get this piece into the game, to willingly give away your dark squared bishop early in the game, I don't know if courage is the right word, but it certainly takes a lot of practice and familiarity. I can't pronounce that word. I'm not going to try again because Ben is already making fun of me. You have to be familiar with these ideas as black, because you are not only giving white space in the center, black attacks the space, but after a3, black most often will give up the bishop. Now, to give up that beautiful bishop, black must feel that they're getting enough counterplay against these shattered pawns on the queen side. It reminded me of an opening I talked about in class, the Gingi Indian defense, named after Roman Gingi-Hashvili, Georgian grandmaster, famous teacher, coach. And after d5, this is a real opening. Not well known, but scores pretty well for black. You give up your only developed piece, your dark squared bishop. You get to double the c-pawns, and then you play f5. You weaken more dark squares, but the idea is to control e4 and not let white build the big center so quickly. And, you know, knight f3 is one move. But you'll see the queen fly out to a5 to immediately attack this weakness. And, you know, this is a pretty cool opening to study and look after. But it reminds me of the win hour, where black gives up here, you know, their only developed piece, just to damage pawns. So as a player with the black pieces here, you must understand the risk you're taking by giving up that dark square bishop, which means if you don't get on these weaknesses, you shouldn't be playing this opening. You have to understand what your ideas are if you're going to play this way. Okay, so obviously Timman, being a world-class grandmaster, knows what he wants to do. So we're still in developing stages. Knight e7. Short chooses to play knight f3 and develop the piece. The more popular somewhat is this move queen g4, which tries to take advantage of the fact that this bishop has been or has left the roost kind of young. And if you play queen c7, you go into one of these poison pawn variations where, you know, you actually give up a couple of pawns right away, but then you take on d4, and that weakness on c3 is exposed right away, this time with a check. And I'll just show you a couple of more moves, like knight e2 to protect the pawn. Pawns come out to attack the center, and then, you know, white can try moves like f4 to support the center. But you put this position on the board, especially if you're not familiar with the ideas, you can have a really hard time. So black can drum up some very interesting counterplay, and white clearly has you know, some advantages of their own. But short chooses instead knight f3. Instead of bringing the queen out early, he just develops his knight. And sure enough, just like in the Gingi Indian, you see black attacking the weakness on c3. And I learned a lot studying this game. I never played this from the white side. I did venture a few win hours as black, and I never had it as white. As an e4 player, I never got a chance to play this. So I saw Short's queen to d2, and of course my first reaction was it was puzzling, like why not just protect this with the bishop? And then as you start to learn the theory of these openings, you see that you see that there are concrete reasons for this. The queen comes to that square in anticipation of possibly having this rook move off the A line, which would leave the A pawn unprotected. And if you remember what I said earlier, if white ever sacrifices or loses this pawn, provided white doesn't mate them in the game, white is going to have to deal with this A pawn much later in the battle, right? Sorry about that. Chess base is going to move whatever you touch. It's like touch move when I do this stuff. Okay, so after queen d2, you see Short protecting with queen to d2. Okay. If Timman decides to make a trade now and trade on d2, this is pretty comfortable for white because the weakness on this side of the board that you created is now gone, and you're going to have to deal with this unopposed bishop. And you can see that this diagonal is going to be a major issue. So black is clearly not interested in getting the queens off the board. So instead, he plays a very sneaky move, bishop to d7. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the French players learn all sorts of tricks in their opening to either activate this piece, have it being used to protect very important pawns on light squares, or trading it off. Short is aware of that. Obviously as a grandmaster, and here these players are still in theory. Granted, back when the game was played in 1987, it wasn't like it is today, but Short simply says to himself, I'm not going to let you trade off this piece, which you can do after the move bishop to d7. So what he does is he plays rook to b1 first, and now you see why he left this bishop down here on c1 to protect this pawn. Now, I think when this bishop woke up in the morning, he was hoping his main goal would not be to protect the pawn. So we'll see if our hero down here on c1 plays a different role later in the game. Okay, so protected. And now after you can't play bishop here, Timman puts it on c6. And there is a reason. It does protect the d pawn in case things open up later in the game. You know, white with the two bishops may try to break at some point. And if you ever play c4 and pawn takes, you may open up this bishop on c6. Another reason is to open the d7 square. You see why? Indeed, the knight will go to d7 and then castle long. I love to say the word indeed. It makes me feel much smarter than I actually am. So now after bishop c6, now the bishop comes to d3, and it's a pretty multi-purpose move. If you let it stick here on this square and you castle short, you may have some tactical issues with the h-pawn, or at least, you know, white could attack you on that side of the board. And it also gives white the option, if you ever decide to develop this knight, to f5, where they could shatter the center. So it's a pretty cool move. It goes a little deeper actually in some lines where black wants to trade on d4. Can you envision the c file and there being pressure on this square? So bishop to d3 is a pretty cool move. All right, so knight to d7. Everybody's continuing with their plan, and now castle. After castle, we have a very interesting option for black, which Timman decides to go for. He closes the line. He stabilizes the queen side, meaning there are no more breaks. Because if you back up for a minute, in the future, if white ever does break on c4, do you see that there is actually this double break When you have doubled C pawns, keep that in mind, chess players. When you do have doubled pawns that can attack, that sometimes you can double break. Like imagine this bishop up here on C6. If it were a pawn and I did break, and then eventually you let me take on this square and you took back with a pawn, I can break again. So when you have doubled pawns, sometimes one way to get rid of them is using the famous double break. That's not going to happen here. So Timman shuts down the queen side and making these weakness, or at least the C pawn and the A pawn, static weaknesses. They're not going away. They're kind of fixed. So Black is thinking, if I close this side of the board and castle over here, it's not going to be that clear that this rook by itself is going to be able to attack my king. The other problem is these are pawn wedges, right? You see there's 3 pawn wedges here. You don't just break pawn wedges. So if you can't break them, then the black king may live a healthy life over here on the queen side. So Short naturally moves the bishop. And Timman now decides to play the move h6. And this move is kind of designed to stop the knight from coming to g5, freeing the f pawn in case white wants space and to attack on that side of the board. So that's what h6 was about. And then Short plays h4, kind of clamping down on the g5 square so that you can't break. Now, when I first saw this move, I'm thinking to myself, man, I'm not so sure I want to play h4 with the black king not committed. As a matter of fact, he castles right now, and I thought this was kind of a strange move. But as you'll see, if you can stop this move, pawn to g5, or at least maybe you win a pawn, it's not that easy for black to double rooks. And the other issue is the queen is on the other side of the board. So this is a real restricting move that you can get away with. Now, if any of you or myself were planning to play h-pawn moves with your king here, you have to make sure strategically you understand the real idea behind the move, which is obviously playable here. Okay, so after castle long, now bishop to d1. And this is kind of a deep move. The idea is to clear the E line, because I think Short's sitting here going, well, where is Timman's play going to come? What is he going to do? And he is actually going to try to open things up on this side of the board to attack the white king, but maybe by doing it quickly the way he did with f5, maybe he could have waited a little bit before doing this, because you'll see again in a moment why bishop to d1, allowing this rook to come into the game, was such a cool idea. He plays f5. Short takes. Timman takes with the knight. Could he have taken with the g-pawn? Indeed. There it goes again, indeed. And maybe this was not a bad way to play, opening up the g-file to the white king, having control over e5 so this horse doesn't jump in there. And just in case these light squares started to get hit a little much, you might be able to put a knight on f8 someday and cover that weak pawn over here. But he takes with the knight. Now, immediately in this, or after this trade, my advice to you is, anytime the pawn structure changes significantly, and you're going to have to really make your own definition of what is significant or not, or your own interpretation. Mine is that when you open a line like that, especially against a player with 2 bishops, when you only have one and it's very passive, you have to make sure that your play is very, very clear. And Timman's idea was not only to open the f-file, but he's thinking he can use the knight on f6 to come to the e4 square. But I think after queen e1, which immediately targets that weak pawn, I think Timman overlooked the fact that this knight here on e4 was not going to be permanent. It's here now with a purpose. Hello, Ben. You know, every time I say purpose, Ben thinks I say porpoise. That's why I always say purpose on purpose. Oh, God. Anyway, so it attacks the c-pawn, and it is a beautifully placed piece. But short, man, I'm telling you, I love these moves. Just rook b4 blocks out the queen. Notice our hero down here on c1 is not moved yet. Keeps the a pawn protected. The rook stops the queen from harassing the c pawn. And now Timman, rook h to f8. As we said before, his play is designed for counterplay, so excellent. And short outposts his knight. And this is a true outpost square. Obviously, by now, all of you at 4 o'clock know what that is. And you'll see the difference that the black knight can be booted out with the move f3. Okay, so at this point, Timman returns the queen to where she thinks she's going to be needed. This pawn will be attacked at some point. So, you know, knowing your weaknesses will be attacked, you might as well bring your most powerful piece in the zone where she could be useful. And after this knight moves, you never know, she might swing into the zone where she could be deadly. So that's why queen c7 was played. And sure enough, the weaknesses will be attacked. This is just a wonderful strategic game. It's very clear when you spend enough time and really think about what these players are trying to accomplish. So, you know, why bishop to g4? Well, it attacks a real weakness in the camp, and that's responded with or answered by rook f6. It just clearly, you know, protects the pawn. And then f3. So you see that f3 is played only after the bishop has been retreated. Knight to d6, and now a kind of a cool move. He plays bishop h3, which keeps the same work here on this line here, attacking that. And you know, I mentioned also in class how bishops are amazing pieces. They can take a step backwards and still control the important squares, where knights can never do that. Anytime you make a knight move, they cannot control the same square, obviously. And that's one of the advantages of having an unopposed bishop. Knights, when they face bishops, are unopposed on one move and not on the other. I hope you're following me. It depends on what color square your knight's sitting on. So by hopping to h3, the bishop maintains the pressure, and it opens the g4 square, possibly for the knight to hit the rook, trying to remove one of the defenders at some point of this pawn. Okay, so bishop to d7. Again, when this bishop woke up, I don't think it was hoping to having, you know, to be this babysitter, but Timman thinks it's extremely important to keep that pawn protected. And then rook f2. Again, when you don't see forcing tactical moves, follow your plan. What is Short's plan? He just wants to hammer away at the c6 pawn. So why did he play rook f2? That's very good. He's going to play it over to e2 at the right moment. Knight to c6. Concept here, challenging our opponent's best piece and attacking the rook. So what to do with the rook? I mean, do you put it here on this square to protect the c pawn? No. You put it on b1 because its future belongs to come after this e pawn. You can't take the knight right away because you get forked. Sorry about that. It's amazing how these boxes just pop up when you make these videos. Okay, so rook back to b1, and now here we go. Sorry about that. So you guys see that, right? You can't take the knight because you'll get forked. That's not good. So instead, he challenges the knight again with knight to f7, and here Short. This is one of the main reasons I showed this game. This is reminds me of a Petrosian game that I had seen where he has an absolute beautiful knight, and a Fischer game as well. Actually, it may have been Fischer who did it to Petrosian, who has this beautiful knight in the center, and he takes a bishop that can hardly move. But the bishop is a wonderful defender, and by walking the queen onto this square here, there are all sorts of tactical issues based on the h3 c8 diagonal. Now, some of you who are keenly aware of tactics may have noticed that you could win a pawn here. You can take, and when the rook takes back, you cash in and grab a pawn. You can, and you are up a pawn, and you are probably slightly better as white, and I'm only saying slightly because your bishop could get pinned, and if you protect it, and then rook d to e8, and stare at this long enough, and you'll see that you are up a pawn. But every single black piece is in the game at this point, which changes things totally from the way Short played this game. He doesn't want the pawn yet. Let's go back to here. He doesn't want the pawn. Instead, he takes the bishop, and when the queen takes back, he plays bishop f4, bringing the last minor piece into the game tactically. It's such a cool idea because I don't think you want to take that bishop with your rook, because again, you see this bishop on h3, you lose the pawn and then eventually big mama. So after bishop f4, it gets attacked. And beautiful demonstration of calculation by Short. He wants to play rook to e2, which he does. And you may ask, well, doesn't that lose a piece? It does not. Rook takes e6 is crushing. It is such a strong move. Can you guys see that? Tactics are really not that hard if you spend the time looking at it. So after g5, Timman's like, well, you got to move your bishop. And again, Short's like, well, no, I don't. He just increases the pressure. Now after rook e8, now he has to move the bishop, and he tucks it all the way in. So our hero went from c1 all the way to h2, and the possibility of the queen coming to this diagonal. I just want to point out that both of these bishops are technically unopposed. There are no bishops to fight them, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, the knights can do it, but every time they move, they'll be fighting a different bishop. So I don't know what that means, but I think you do. Okay, bishop goes back to h2. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. To Timman's credit, he's opening lines on this side of the board while white is planning to attack the pawn on e6. There are plenty of open lines for black as well. So this is still a pretty sharp game at this point. Knight g5. Active defense or counterplay. Timman is not sitting around waiting for you to just kill him here. You have to be careful. There's already, moves like rook takes at h3, and you could lose your queen. You see what happens when you play actively and you put pieces near the opponent's king? So Short sees that and does not want to allow this bishop to come off the board. So he plays bishop to g4, and now here comes Timman. He might be playing for a move like h5 here, thinking that, if he can play h5, he may trap the queen. But you have to be careful, because I'm not so sure you're trapping my queen with this move. If you come here, Short has ideas like rook takes e6, and if you're not careful and just go ahead and take your queen, you get mated. You guys see that? That's pretty cool stuff. And these two bishops over here are just monsters. So, when he plays queen to g7, he's thinking, well, Short has to do something with his queen or block this pawn from moving. And Short's like, no, I don't. He just brings in the last piece. And at this point, Timman realized that he's not going to get anything out of h5, so he plays the move b6, which is designed only to open a hole for his king. So he's going to be going back into defensive mode. And let me just show you again, if you play h5, I don't know, just queen here and rook h8, and we just take that. I don't know, you can try to take with your knight, but again, just rook takes, and you can work the tactics out for yourself, but you're not going to get the white queen. So Timman decides it's time for defense and plays b6, and now short stops h5 and just says, that's it, you're not moving anything on that side, and complete cover up now, trying to get into defensive mode, and now f4, hitting the knight. The knight hops into e4, and the idea is to shield the e-pawn, and this is when I advise you to, well, one of the times, you guys should be pausing the videos all the time, but really study positions like this and ask yourself, what is the value of my opponent's piece that they just moved? It is the only real defensive piece in the game. I guess you can say it's offensive as well because it's in white's territory, but short just takes it, and that's like a cruncher. It's like, oh man, are you kidding me? Well, after the pawn takes, you just have to see the follow-up d5, which is devastating. You can't take it with the queen because I just take it. Well, not me. I wish it was me. But that pin will cost you a whole queen. That's not pretty. So after d5, the black center is just going to collapse. So knight to d8, he's just in complete retreat mode. And now queen e5, right on those dark squares, and you can imagine what's coming next. Rook f5, desperately hoping to give the exchange back to take off some pressure. If you move this rook to g6, for example, f5's coming anyway. And if you take that free bishop, how about a free king? You see those bishops? Yeah, just absolute killers, just beautiful. You guys see these tactics? I hope you do. So after d5, knight d8, just going completely backwards, centralizing the queen, rook f5, trying to give the exchange back, and short just takes on e6. If you take the queen, he takes your queen check, and everything you have is hanging as black. So Timman just comes in. Hey, why not? It's like mate in one down there. So he just takes the pawn, protects his rook. Everything is hanging now, so rook to d5, just desperately trying to hold things together. e7, discovered check. King c7, f5, discovered check, and Timman called it a day. My friends, it's a long video, but it is a wonderful game. If you go over the notes and watch the video, I assure you, you are really going to help your chess. These guys played an amazing game.